So I want to spend this session talking about the transmission of the Siddur. And talking about the transition of the Siddur starts with talking a little bit about the development of the liturgy as an organized and more or less set body of text organized in a certain way. Even well before the first time that we know of it being written down and preserved in that sense. So the sort of very basic structure of the prayer services that we know already are start with the Tanaim and the very, very early Amoraim. But even in a more robust sense, there is a body of liturgical texts, of composed liturgical texts that develop in the first couple of centuries after the Mishnah, and we know this because there are significant divergences between the liturgical text of the Eretz Yisrael communities and of the Babylonian communities in the later period, as we get into the Gaonim in the 8th, 9th centuries. Significant differences, but those differences are variations off of a common core of text. For instance, the Shemona Esrei, Weekday Amidah, what we know of as the Eretz Yisrael version that we found copies of in the Geniza, for instance, looks like an earlier version of that has been reworked and reshaped to the version that was accepted in Babylonia and then became the standard in Europe and through to today. So they diverged at some point, but they did both come from a common core set of texts. At some point, that core travels to Babylonia. It develops independently in the two centers, leading to all sorts of divergences. There are divergences of wording and text. There are divergences of minhag and various aspects of practice. We know about these divergences from a very important sort of book, the record of minhag differences between East and West, essentially, which was written in the middle of the Gaonic period already. So that was really a contemporary testimony. We know it from the comments of some Gaonim and Rishonim. Our understanding of the extent and nature of the differences between Palestinian and Babylonian ritual minhagim was vastly expanded by the Cairo Geniza. Because remember the Cairo Geniza, the Egyptian community was much more closely aligned with, connected with, and dependent on the Palestinian community and rabbinic leadership as opposed to the Babylonian. So the vast majority of the materials we have from the Geniza reflect Palestinian minhag, much of which we had no previous kind of actual concrete evidence about. The other piece of the difference is when I talked about midrash, that midrash, especially midrash Agadah, was an activity that was centered only in Eretz Yisrael, It happened in Eretz Yisrael. It never really made its way to Bavel in any kind of real way. It was never embraced or accepted or really utilized by the Gaonim in Bavel, at least till the very end of the Gaonic period. The Gaonim never, it's not an activity that the Babylonians ever engaged in. It was a kind of theological and literary creativity that was simply not part of not on the agenda of the Babylonian Gaonim. Similarly with liturgy, the great liturgical poets, the early sort of super intricate liturgical poems with allusions to varieties of biblical stories, whether some of the oldest high holiday piyutim, the famous Akdamut of Shavuot. There are two sort of very early piyutim that are part of the Pesach Haggadah, towards the end of the Haggadah. These were all composed in the late Amoraic period, the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries in Eretz Yisrael. So we have a liturgical core that is brought to Bavel and then developed separately there. We have this whole other piece of these distinct both minhagim and this whole genre of liturgical poetry and other types of kind of liturgical creativity happening in Eretz Yisrael that is foreign to the Babylonian community. So now, when I say foreign to the Babylonian community, it's not just that they didn't know some of those texts or recognize them. The early Gaonim and the first, the text that is that forms the foundation for the liturgy and the prayer texts of all of the European communities was Seder Rav Amram Gaon. Rav Amram Gaon was a Gaon in the mid 800s. Rav Amram Gaon and his predecessors tended to be very suspicious of and often very denigrating of or rejected alternative prayer texts. And the reason they were so suspicious of those texts was because they assumed that represented the practice of sectarian groups, even though the Karaites, the main sectarian threat to the Babylonian Gaonim, had not really come into their own yet. They were really just in their origins in the 9th century. Nonetheless, alternative prayer texts were assumed to be from a sectarian community, and therefore the adoption of such texts, the embracing of a sectarian, a rejection of rabbinic Judaism, that was usually not the case. Usually the texts that they were heaping scorn on, it turns out, were simply reflected the wider range of variation of practice in the Palestinian rabbinic community. And the Babylonians simply didn't recognize that. A century later, Rav Sadia Gaon in the mid 10th century, Rav Sadia Gaon's Siddur is the other major prayer text that was written down and brought to Europe. Rav Sadia is a polemicist to his core. He is all about establishing primacy and hegemony against all comers. That put him in conflict with the leadership of the rabbinic community in Eretz Yisrael. It put him in conflict with the exilarch, the sort of political leader of the Jewish community in Babylonia, and he he was ferocious in his attacks on the Karaites, who by his time had become a major threat to the rabbinic community. So Rasaji is absolutely fierce in rejecting the validity of a whole variety of liturgical variations and innovations, though he's accepting of others. And the fact that he's somewhat very inconsistent about that is part of what makes it clear that when he is telling you what is okay and what is in the limits of what's okay, definitely the limits, that he is motivated as much as or or even more by needing to draw a line against against the Karaites as any particular ideology about liturgical innovation, even though these kinds of rulings are always couched in the language of what kind of liturgical innovation is or isn't allowed. That was usually not really what underlay the challenges and the concerns. And just as an aside, in modern times, the same thing kind of played itself out, where various liturgical innovations, small and large, proposed by Reform Jews, conservative Jews, even back in the 19th century Europe, even by Hasidim, even earlier than that, were always attacked on the grounds, by appealing to the Talmud's rules about what types of liturgical variation are or are not permitted, even though those principles, are it's very unclear exactly what they mean. But usually there's an appeal to principles. What's really going on is there's a community that we see as fundamentally sectarian in some way. That was true. The Mitnagdim certainly saw the Hasidim as sectarian, and certainly obviously reform and conservative, closer to our own day. And it was really the need to define other, sort of threatening groups out that lay behind those positions. But that was Rasadia in the 10th century. By the 11th century, the last great titanic figure of the Gaonic period, Rav Hai Gaon, is much more understanding of and tolerant of liturgical variation. He is at a point where he and his community, he understands that their power has ebbed and they simply need to be more solicitous of and therefore respectful of communities, far-flung communities that seem to have variant practices. He also is simply much more aware than Rav Sadia or Rav Amram of the extent of liturgical variation within the firmly rabbinic community, as you sort of across geographical regions. Now, the Siddur gets to Europe, and this is, we know, this is a very concrete moment. We have a tshuva, several tshuvot where Rav Amram writes about the Siddur, and one where he very explicitly talks about deciding in response to a request from a community in Spain to write down the prayer liturgy as it is recited in the yeshivot of Babel and send it to the community in Spain so that they could do the same ritual. And that is, he writes a text that he sends off to communities in Spain, and it gets copied and recopied and disseminated from there. So we know when it gets to Europe, we know how it gets there, and we know that it is specifically Rav Amram's version of the Babylonian practice that gets sent. Rav Amram sends his text, not only the texts of the liturgy, but sort of various halachot of tefillah and sort of guidelines and explanations. And it becomes a popular text. It is widely copied. It is responsible for the first stage of creating liturgical uniformity across communities in Europe. It is a written text that could be copied, shared between communities, and leading to communities in all the communities in a region having more or less the same prayer minhagim, prayer practices and texts. At the same time, prayer is something that those communities did before the Siddur arrived there. In exactly what form is hard to know, but it did have a prayer practice. I kind of want to pause here to just look at a map for a second, just to give you a sense. Right here, let's see if I can do a little pen thing here. Right over here is the Caliphate of Baghdad. Right, is where the Gonim sat. Right here is Eretz Yisrael. Right, and Egypt. Right, these two communities, right, really are the other alternative community, but the communities here in North Africa, in Kairouan, and here in Spain are still very closely connected to Baghdad and right to the Babylonian Gonim, and so both the Babylonian Talmud and the text of the Siddur eventually are sent the other direction to those communities. And indeed, for the most part, Spanish communities, they asked for the liturgical tradition of the Gaonic academies, and they more or less implemented and followed that practice. Now, from here, from these communities, it was then sent northward, right? And as it gets copied, communities, especially as you get here into Provence, and right here's Provence over here, right? Marseille and Nice are there today, and up into the Germanic and Frankish regions, which are the early Ashkenazi communities, and even here in Tuscany, in the kind of northern Italian region, you have communities that have already their own prayer minhagim. And while they want the Siddur of Amram and they embrace it, they also are hold on to and value their own practices. So when the Seder of Amram gets copied, a community will add in their own local practices and texts. Now, this is not in an attempt to be sort of it's not to counterfeit at all. Rather, first of all, before the Talmud got to these communities, they didn't have Talmud. There was not another Talmud that they wanted to then add in to the Babylonian Talmud. When the Babylonian Talmud was brought, they studied that. Not so with prayer, right? The Siddur came into places that already had their own prayer practices. In addition, the Babylonian Gonim were very insistent on the primacy and inviolate nature of the Babylonian Talmud. They were that was the text of record for for a sort of official Jewish halacha, practice, halacha, and the curriculum for study. They did not invest the Siddur with anything like the same sense of authority. They said, "Oh, here's the liturgy as we do it in the Babylonian academies." But if I'm making a copy, if I'm copying out and writing out a ritual manual for this community, what I need is not a record of an ancient text. What I need is the set of prayers that this community needs. And therefore, I'm naturally going to write to copy down the prayers from Rav Amram and other prayers that are in the book that I received, and also the other prayers that we in this community have a practice of reciting, all together. And then when that text is sent on to another community, the next community is likely to not have no way to distinguish what was the original Rav Amram versus the things that have been added in at stops along the way. It's not like the Tanakh, which was finalized, and then when Midrash is composed centuries later, the Midrashists are very, very careful and to distinguish the text of Tanakh, the actual Tanakh text, from their explanation. Right? There's a very bright line separating. That is not the case here, and there's simply no way to know. And you receive this text under the title of Seder Rav Amram, and you take it all to be Seder Rav Amram, which is why, on the one hand, we have many, 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 many more copies of Seder of Amram found around in places across Europe than Seder of Saja, which came a little less than a century later and was far less widely disseminated. But also, huge variation. There's no, by a couple centuries later, you can't even talk about a single book that is Seder of Amram, because floating around Europe are 20 different versions of Seder of Amram that vary from each other quite widely, because as it has been transmitted in different ways and through different routes, it has accumulated additional texts, additional practices, and as you may know from simply davening, it is generally our way over time to add to the Siddur, but not to take away. And so those accretions build up over time. Now, where did all of those local minhagim come from? Especially given that once you get out of Spain and crossing into into Christian Europe, you have lots of local minhagim that are different than what the Babylonian academies were doing, and thus didn't come from the Babylonian academies. Where did those come from? And the answer is that the community in Italy in particular always retained its connection to Eretz Israel. Retained it would, those communities would reach out to the rabbis in Eretz Israel with questions and for halachic guidance. And if you just think for a second about the going from the community over here, it's actually much closer, right? And there's a lot of direct interchange between Israel and Egypt, right? And the Italian community. So it didn't. They apparently never got the Talmud Yerushalmi. That only went kind of over here to Kairouan. But what they did get was a whole host of Eretz Yisrael minhagim. They got. Remember, we talked about how over time there was developed a huge catalog of differences in minhag of all sorts between the Palestinian community and the Babylonian. The Italian community seems to have received and adopted large parts of the Palestinian minhag and transmitted that as the communities in northern Italy and then in Germany and France all started with Jews migrating northward from the Italian peninsula. So those communities, therefore, by extension, and especially, and this is before the Babylonian Talmud or Babylonian minhagim penetrated anywhere close to that far. They had these Eretz Israel practices, and that means both things like that they had simply different practices that they were committed to and wanted to hold on to, even once they received the Babylonian Seder of Amram, and therefore they held on and they added it to their version. They added their own text to their version of Seder of Amram. There are all sorts of there's a whole genre of texts, these piyutim, that the Babylonians had tried to get to eliminate from the Siddur and from sort of popular practice, which you find many sort of manuscripts of Seder of Amram in Ashkenaz, in Germany, for instance, which have all of those piyutim added in. And aside from the general differences of practice and this whole genre of liturgical text, there was also simply a tradition of liturgical variation. It's not just that in Eretz Yisrael they were more creative. There was not the culture of halacha being paramount and being the unifying force in Eretz Yisrael and in the Eretz Yisrael practice, and therefore there was never the expectation that all of the communities within that sphere of influence would all have exactly the same practice. There was an assumption of and a validation of local practice, which is why the German Jewish communities throughout the Middle Ages were famous for having hyper local minhagim, especially around tefillah and around certain and around certain of the chagim, where the minhag of Frankfurt and the minhag of Weint and Speyer and each of these towns was its own kind of little its own little world. And that too was a part of the culture the of the Central European Jewish communities that was adhered to in the face of the kind of liturgical sort of incursion of this kind of homogenizing force of official Babylonian texts. That battle over, and the kind of battle is a little, but that ongoing struggle over liturgical uniformity or variation was played out also in parallel in the struggle over changing local minhagim in those communities to adhere to the halacha of the Babylonian Talmud as it spreads and becomes the text of record across the Jewish world.